Throne of Liberty has millions of different stats, and if you don't understand what these stats are doing, you will most likely be following a wrong build and be at a huge disadvantage in PvP but also in PvE. This is why I've created this ultimate stat guide, where I will explain every single stat in the game. I will try to keep it as simple as possible, but if the level of detail in this video is not enough for you, no worries, I have plenty of videos explaining stats in more detail, which will be always linked in the video. Okay, let's start with our first stat, base damage. Now this stat is always the base of all your skills. It does not matter if it's a healing skill, a damage skill, or a shield skill. When you use an ability, the game rolls between these two values, so between your min damage and your max damage. And then it takes this value to calculate how much damage you do, how much you heal, how much you shield, and so on. So for example, the focused fire bombs deal 510% of your base damage as damage. Since this is always the basis for all of your skills, base damage is just really important. Now let's come to the next stat, attack speed. Attack speed reduces the animation time of all your skills. So let's say you use the skill like serial firebombs. Now attack speed reduces the time it takes you to charge all of those fireballs. The more attack speed you have, the faster you can do the animation. Again, it does not matter what kind of skill it is. It can be an instant skill, it can be a chargeable skill, or whatever. Attack speed reduces the time it takes for your character to perform an attack. So in the end, it means that attack speed allows you to make all of your combos faster. And the system just takes this total attack speed value as reference. The lower this value is, the faster your attack speed will be. Next we have range. Most people think that range only impacts the range on which you can use your skills. And that's of course also correct, but it does even more. So if you hold on your skills, you often see that distance stat. This stat is being influenced by your range. So for range abilities like Judgment Lightning or melee abilities like the Guillotine, you can simply be further away from your target. It's not only for range abilities, it's also for melee abilities. But now there are also skills like Devastating Tornado, which also has a distance value. But here this value is increasing the radius of the ability, so it's increasing the AoE effect. This is of course an exception. For most abilities, it's just impacting how far you can be away from your target. Just keep in mind that if you have the distance value on your ability, you can impact it with your range. Okay, so next we have two stats that are weapon specific. Firstly, we have the shield block chance, which only the sword and shield have. So shield block chance is the best defensive stat in the game. Every time you get hit with an SNS in your hand, you have a chance to block 40% of the incoming damage. So say someone hits you with 1000 damage, then you have a chance to reduce it to 600 damage. But the important thing to remember is that you need to have your SNS in your hand at the moment when you get hit. Let's say for some reason you use Devastating Tornado in a PvP fight. This is a great sword skill which you have in this moment in your primary hand, which means your sword and shield is not in your hand at that moment. And that means you cannot block any attacks with the shield block chance. That's why it's so important to have your sword and shield always in your primary hand. So when you are, for example, not using any skill, you still have your shield block chance active. Because this is the main reason why tanks are so tanky. But you can also counter this stat with shield block penetration chance. Every point of pierce chance you have reduces your opponent's block chance. It's pretty straightforward. In tier 1 we were really limited here, but in tier 2 we now get a lot of options to really stack this if we want to. Okay, so the second weapon specific stat is offhand weapon chance. This one is only relevant for crossbow and daggers. It gives you a chance that skills you use will be used a second time. So for example, say you use Brutal Incision. Normally you would see 1 damage number because you would only attack with the dagger in your right hand. But when the offhand weapon chance procs, you will see 2 damage numbers because you will perform the ability once with your right dagger and once with your left dagger. And this is of course a really powerful stat for those 2 weapons. Okay, so before we get into all the other stats, you will often see that stats are broken down into the 3 main different attack types: melee, magic and ranged. Greatsword, sword and shield, spear and dagger are your melee weapons. All the abilities from those weapons fall into melee attack types. It does not matter if it's a stun or a ranged ability or whatsoever. All abilities from those weapons fall into the melee category. On the other hand, wand and staff are your only magic weapons, and range comes only from the crossbow and the bow. These are the basics you need to understand, of course. Okay, then let's move on to the next stat, which is defense. This one is pretty straightforward. It's just a percentage reduction of all incoming damage. For example, 1700 melee defense is about 40% damage reduction on all melee attacks. So if a great sword would deal 1000 damage on an attack, you would reduce it to 600 damage. So the more defense you get, the more damage reduction you get. But as so often the case in Throne of Liberty, there are diminishing returns. Next we have hit chance and evasion. When we look at one of these stats, we always have to look also at the other one. For these stats I have to go a little bit more into the details, because I really want you to understand this. So how does it work? Evasion allows you to completely avoid an attack from your opponent. Not just the damage, but also any form of CC, debuff or effect that comes with the ability. But there's also something called hit. And if your enemy has a lot of hit, then he increases his chance to hit the skill. So let's say you have 600 evasion and your enemy has 500 hit. Then he reduces your evasion with his hit. That means against this target you have only 100 evasion. I don't want to go here too much into the details, but here's just one thing you need to understand. And that's if your enemy has more hit than you have evasion, your evasion is completely useless. Let's say your enemy has 700 hit now, and you still have only 600 evasion. Then all your evasion is completely non-existent. This is something you need to understand. If you want to build evasion in tier 2, you really need to understand how much hit all the other builds have. Because otherwise it might be the case that you're just wasting your stats. If you don't want to think about that, I totally get it. But then don't play evasion, just go endurance. So what is endurance? If we want to understand endurance, we also have to look on critical hit chance. Let's start with crit. Of course, the more crit chance you have, the higher the chance for you to crit. But what does crit even mean? Okay, so at the beginning, when we talked about base damage, I said that when you use an ability, the game rolls between your min and your max damage, which then defines your base damage of your ability, right? Now you have to understand, if you crit, you no longer roll between those two values. You always use the maximum damage as a base. This would be now used to calculate the damage of my skill. But if I crit, I also have a crit multiplier. So in my case, I have an extra 40% crit damage on top of that. So first of all, the game takes the max damage to calculate the bases. And then we have always this critical damage factor on top of that. Okay, so we understood crit. But now it's important to understand that your enemy can reduce your crit chance with endurance. It's the same as evasion and hit. If you have 600 crit and your opponent has 500 endurance, then you have only 100 crit chance against that guy. One more important thing is that if your opponent has more endurance than you have crit, you can no longer crit this target. For example, if you have 600 crit, but your enemy has 700 endurance, you can't crit anymore. This almost didn't happen in tier 1, but will for sure happen a lot in tier 2. So the good part about endurance compared to evasion is, even if you just have a little bit of endurance, you always reduce the chance of your enemy to crit you. So if you're unsure about certain thresholds and you just want to have something useful, then just go endurance. There's also a stat called critical damage resistance, which reduces the damage from crits you take. It's just the counterpart to critical damage. Critical damage increases the damage of critical hits, and critical damage resistance decreases the damage of those critical hits. Okay, so the next stat is heavy attack chance. This gives you a chance to double your damage. Let's say you use Judgment Lightning. If it hits heavy, then you will always see a purple number, and at the end of the number you see a ×2. It just simply doubles your damage. It's obviously really powerful. There's also the stat heavy attack evasion, which just counters those attacks. So it works similar to hit and evasion and crit and endurance. Next we have skill damage resistance and skill damage boost. Both straightforward. Skill damage boost increases the damage of all of your skills and also increases your heals. And skill damage resistance reduces the damage of your enemy abilities. Both super strong on every class. You always want to stack that. There are of course diminishing returns for the stat, but there's almost no way to stack too much skill damage resistance or skill damage boost. Now we have bonus damage and damage reduction. This is often misunderstood. So how does it work? I have here 60 bonus damage. Now every damage number you are creating is called a hit. And on each of those hits you add these 60 bonus damage. So for example, the guillotine from the greatsword shows only 1 damage number, so it's also 1 hit, so my 60 bonus damage are only added once. But if I use quickfire from the crossbow for example, I have 4 damage numbers, so these are 4 individual hits. All these 4 hits get 60 bonus damage on top. So you get the point. If you do a lot of hits, then bonus damage is really good. So if you see a lot of damage numbers, if you don't have a crossbow in your hand, there's probably always a better stat that you could go for. And damage reduction works the other way around. So it's good against people who attack a lot, but not so good against people who hit really hard. Also important here, bonus damage and also damage reduction are not influencing dots. Okay, let's come to the next stat, buff duration. So buff duration increases all the buffs that you use. For example, victory energy or enchanting time. These buffs will be simply longer on you. The important thing is that there are no diminishing returns. So if you have 55% buff duration, your buffs will also last 55% longer. If you have a lot of buffs, this can be really nice and strong, and you can stack as much as you want. Debuff duration on the other hand reduces any negative effects your opponent applies on you. So for example, a debuff like a healing reduction effect, or even a stun from a greatsword, or even poison from a dagger. All of these negative effects will have a reduced duration on you. This is also for every class really powerful. But this one comes with diminishing returns. The more you stack, the less you get out of it. So these were the most important stats in the game that you just need to understand. So if you like the video so far, maybe you consider subscribing to the channel, and don't forget to like, of course. Okay, so on the next tab we don't have to talk about all these stats. Most of them are pretty straightforward, but a few of those are still really interesting. So mana cost efficiency is something you might not have in other games. It reduces the amount of mana required to use your skills, and this by a percentage value. But of course this skill also has diminishing returns. The next stat is cooldown speed, which of course reduces the cooldown of all your abilities. Of course, a really powerful stat, but again, just keep in mind that it has also strong diminishing returns. If you hover over the stat, you can always see the actual cooldown reduction of the skill. So I have here 28% cooldown speed, but I only reduce my cooldowns by around 22%. Cooldown speed is a fantastic stat, but just keep in mind there are heavy diminishing returns. The last stat on this page that is a little bit interesting is percentage bonus healing. So of course it just increases your total healing power. So the amount you heal with your abilities, for example. But also similar as to buff duration, this one has no diminishing returns. So I have here 66% bonus healing. That means I actually heal 66% more. So for all the healers out there is no way you can build too much bonus healing. And this counts for all of the healing stats here. Okay, about all the other stats we either talked already or are just simply straightforward. This brings us to the next page, which is all about CC skills. So we have here our chances and we have our resistances. What you need to understand here is that there are 8 different types of CC abilities. All CC skills fall into one of these categories. You can find the type of the skill always in the skill description. For example, Strategic Rush is a collision ability and Stunning Blow is a stun ability. But what are these chances and resistances doing? So if we look again onto our Strategic Rush example, we can see that it has a 70% chance to push an enemy. So collision chance increases now the chance for you to push your enemy. And collision resistance reduces the chance of your enemy to push you. So either this 70% chance increases or decreases. Again, of course, it takes here the difference between your chance and your enemy resistance. If your resistance is higher, you decrease the chance. And if the chance is higher, then you increase your chance. That's it. All of the other stats on the other pages just follow the same rules that we talked about. This side is just specific for different monster types, this one for bosses, and this one for PvP. But all of these stats follow the same rules we just talked about. And the last tab is also pretty straightforward, it's just non-combat stuff. Now the last stats we have to talk about that are also really important are the base stats. So in Throne of Liberty we have Strength, Dexterity, Wisdom, Perception and Fortitude. Important to understand is that Strength, for example, is not directly linked to Greatsword players. Strength can be also really valuable on mages. This is because all these base stats always influence your base damage, but they influence your base damage differently. Strength, Perception and Fortitude influences the min and the max damage, and Wisdom and Dex only influences the max damage. But in general, if you have a lot of base stats, you will increase heavily your base damage, which makes you deal more damage and heal more. But additionally, all these base stats influence all the stats we have just talked about. So strength focuses on defensive stats like max HP and resistances. Dexterity focuses on crits, attack speed and evasion. Wisdom focuses on max mana, mana regeneration and cooldown speed. Perception gives you all form of hit chance, CC chance and also buff duration. And fortitude gives you again endurance and resistances. So all these stats we've just talked about will be influenced by those base stats. Generally, having a lot of base stats is always good, but spending them correctly completely depends on your build. So that is all you need to know about all the stats. Keep in mind, I have tried to simplify most of these stats as much as possible. If you're still unsure about certain topics, feel free to check out my more detailed guides for the different stats. You can find them all in the video description. I've also added some additional information to a pinned comment on this video, because I think some of the information is really valuable, but would be maybe too much for this video and would confuse a lot of people. So also feel free to check this out. Of course, if you have any further questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. If you like the content, don't forget to like, share and do all those good stuff. Thanks for watching and see ya in the next one.